My name is Joy Francis. I'm Executive Director and founder of Words of Colour Productions, which is a creative communications company. And our focus is on writers of colour from all genres. And we've been going for about 12 years now. We're based at Second Home in Spitalfields. And I had the pleasure of bumping into Yassmin. I've had to reduce her bio about 4 times. But what I'm going to say, Sudanese-born Australian, Yassmin, is many things: an author, a broadcaster, by her own admission, a metalhead, and a recovering mechanical engineer and activist, and now a novelist. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So she has written her latest book, which is Must Be Layla, which is targeted at impressionable minds of young people.
You're going to get them early, right?
After Yassmin's story, which was your debut at 24, and your advocacy work has been widely recognised with the 2018 Young Voltaire Award for Free Speech. Of course, your TED Talk, What Does My Headscarf Mean to You, which has been viewed. Is it 2 million? Have you hit the 2 million yet?
Yeah.
Nice.
I'm still figuring
You need
it
to
out.
update your bio now.
Yeah.
So what are we going to talk about? Race, faith, femininity, your identity, being an adopted Londoner as well. But first of all, welcome to Yassmin.
Can you also keep that going for Joy, who is an actual legend? And it is my honor to be on the stage with you, Joy. Thank you for having me.
No, pleasure. How are you?
Ooh, I mean,
how are you doing?
How am I doing? I mean, okay, can we just, the weather today was so good. I'm just such a happy person when there is sunshine in London. It's amazing. People smile at me in the streets, which is highly unusual. So yeah, I'm good. I'm really good.
And like you said, You Must Be Layla is coming out. In Australia, we're led to believe that it's going to be in the UK. So in about a week's time, you're going to be off to Australia, going away from Wednesday, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
All right, for a 2.5-week tour. And when you think about that book and the fact you've got British by Afua Hirsch, you have Renee with Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. You've got the Fly Girls Guide to University. There's clearly a movement in relation to women of colour, brown and black women. What does that indicate to you or say to you, rather than what people tell you it is? Like, for example, it's a renaissance. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting time, I think, to be a woman of colour in the creative space or in any sort of... particularly when it comes to, I think, words at the moment. And I think it's not as if women of colour haven't had something to say for a long time, because we have, and I think there is a long tradition of, Hooks and Lord and many, many women that we're on the backs of, and even women who haven't necessarily written in English alone. I think that we like to think that this is a new moment, but perhaps what it is, it's just a new moment of our words reaching different people, and our stories, especially for those who are part of the diaspora or perhaps part of communities that have been interrupted. So whether they are in the United States, sort of descendants of slaves, here descendant from all sorts of different movements, colonial-based movements or post-colonial-based movements. These are groups and communities that haven't necessarily known where they come from, right? And I think the challenge for those communities is figuring out their voices in that legacy, and also remembering that we aren't alone, these challenges aren't new, and actually I sometimes think that it's helpful to remind ourselves that we aren't necessarily doing something that hasn't been done before, because it grounds us in understanding that we are part of a chain rather than, pioneers and trailblazers in a way that has never existed.
In a way, there is a revival on some levels, because the very thing you're saying about the fact that it's about presenting knowledge that women in their 40s and 50 of colour are aware of. And it's almost like a repackaging, but through this sort of publishing drive at the moment, isn't it? And also sort of dispelling the myth that we don't read books.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a couple of thoughts that I have out of that. The generation that you're talking about, the young sort of millennial generation, have the luxury and the privilege and the mental space to be able to say, okay, we don't have to worry necessarily in the same way like our parents did about survival, although I will say that some of us do still, of course. But all of a sudden there's this mental space to be like, okay, what does it mean now to be who we are? And also, our parents, the stories that our parents told us were from their worlds, right? They don't necessarily match up to the worlds that we're in now. And so how do we figure out what that new story looks like? And it's a really interesting challenge, because I do think what's different is that we've never lived in a globalized world in the way that we have. Because all of a sudden my words, which come out of a story from Brisbane, Australia, are being read by Londoners and by kids in like Texas. And people are relating to different parts of the story, but the context isn't always the same. And so figuring out the nuance and being careful, I think, with that is also really important.
But it's funny you said about being careful, and I know you're very mindful of technology, even though you're incredibly prolific on social media. I'm going to come back to that. And it's funny, I want to, before I ask you to read from Yassmin's story, I just want to come back about the thing about the mind space. That I feel slightly different about that. If anything, it seems as if there's an ease and a readiness to engage with social media in a way that we didn't have, because I'm analog and digital. Whereas I'm hearing from a lot of young millennial women of colour about the lack of headspace because they're so busy creating, delivering. So I think that it looks as if there's space because a lot's being created, but in reality, it creates another challenge. Yeah, but we'll come back to that, because right? But you come back to that. I'm going to stump you. Look, I'm warming up now. So what I want to do is introduce you to read a couple of extracts from your first book, Yassmin's story, your memoir.
Awesome. So I thought I would start at the beginning with my prologue, because I think it gives you the context for why, like a 23, 24-year-old thought it was a good idea to write a memoir. I mean, even it just sounds so cocky. My life. Anyway, so I'm sitting on a helideck in the middle of the ocean, hundreds of kilometers away from any land. It's the dead of night, the only time I find peace and the chance to be alone on an oil rig full of, well, mostly men. When you live with over 100 not quite strangers for weeks at a time, sharing accommodation, bathrooms, meals, and work, you do become family. But those precious moments of being alone with your thoughts are few and far between. This helideck is my refuge. The surface of the dark green landing pad is rough. I sit cross-legged in the middle of the brightly lit H that marks the touchdown spot in the center of the octagon. This raised platform was never meant for human lounging, but I'm always one for repurposing. Why am I here? This is my day job. I work as a drilling engineer on oil and gas rigs, and my career so far has taken me to remote rigs on land and in the ocean, around Australia and the world. I'm sometimes on call, sometimes on a roster of 1 month on, 1 month off. A day job, however, doth not a woman make. I have the privilege and blessing of taking on multiple identities. Yes, I'm a mechanical engineer. I'm also a practicing Muslim woman, alhamdulillah, a founder of a youth-led organization, a former race car team principal, a Sudanese-born member of the Arab African diaspora, a Queenslander, a boxer, a doer, and hopefully also a thinker who's able to add value, to be useful. Yo, 23-year-old Yassmin had a lot of damn, I haven't read this in a while. I'm like, all right, I see you. Wow. I care about leaving this, oh, she really did. Bless her heart. I care about leaving this world a better place, so I spend my time advocating and agitating for that positive change. Oh. Why am I here, typing up my story under the moonlight with the never-ending din of machinery in the background? The rig derrick shines brightly in front of me, a 40-meter-high beacon of industrialization in an unforgiving and terribly beautiful landscape. Why tell this tale at all? When I was growing up, I didn't see stories about people with lives I could relate to. There were no stories centering on young women, people of color, or Muslims. There were definitely no stories of young migrant Muslim women who grew up eating mahshi and listening to Avril Lavigne. The stories being told about people like me are often told by people who are not like me, and often without permission. It is exhausting to forever be talked about without being involved in the conversation in a meaningful manner. Yes, some people do try, but it is not enough to be invited to speak only when spoken to. Also, I've never been one to wait my turn. This book is about reclaiming the narrative, redefining it to my lived experience and the varied experiences of the strong women and mentors in my life. And in doing so, I hope to provide some insight into a different world, one that has always existed, but has not often been acknowledged by the society I live in, the West. I'm writing to share my story, but I'm not arrogant enough to believe it's particularly remarkable or unique. This is not about teaching, as I still have so much to learn. It is about sharing experiences and the lessons learned along the way, as well as asking the questions those experiences continue to raise. It is clear that we're facing immense challenges as a global society and will continue to in the decades to come. Creating effective responses to these challenges will only happen through a combination of critical thought and fully considered action, a balance I've been searching for throughout my very short life. I've been grateful to have been involved in a lot of doing for something of my age. And this book is about some of that doing, but hopefully some of the thinking that lay behind those actions as well. Hopefully those stories will add texture and context to a different perspective. That of a young Muslim woman post 9/11, of a girl who grew up seeing the strong women around her all wearing hijabs and being confused as to why the world was telling her those same women were oppressed. Hopefully, they will encourage thought and discussion around why we, as Australians and global citizens, are at the crossroads we are. This isn't just my story. This is the story of so many other young people, so many other women, so many other people of faith and color. My story might seem unique because it does not fit in with what you expect from a young Australian Muslim woman. But there are many stories of young Muslims, women, and people of color that challenge, question, and inspire without tokenism or self-doubt. The difference is, a lot of those stories never see the light of day, don't make it into our news feeds or the morning television shows, because not everyone has a ready platform from which to share their story. Alhamdulillah, I've been blessed with access to a microphone, and as such, it's my responsibility and duty to make the most of it for myself and the many others who don't yet have that space. I write this story, my story, and the story of the people around me who have created who I am, so that I can open a window into another world, the world of an Arab African Muslim migrant woman who calls Australia home, of a chick on a rig, of a motorsport maniac, of a lady who lifts, of a smart mouth and hijab. This world isn't so far away though, and any partition can be so easily dismantled, bit by bit. After all, we're just drops in the same ocean. What are we waiting for? I was so optimistic. Oh.
When was the last time you read that?
I have not picked that up. Probably, for maybe like 3-4 years.
And you've had an incredibly
it's been a wild couple
4
of
years. Yeah. I want to take you back now, just a bit. And I'm going to quote you. Lord
Always dangerous.
Yeah, I'll take the risk. Right? Lord knows Muslim women are so much more than the piece of cloth they choose to wrap or not wrap their head in. This is about looking beyond your bias. I'm looking at you, but this is me saying that to you. This is looking beyond your bias, a bit like what you did, Yassmin, in the TED Talk, which took place on the 27th of, it was posted on the 27th of May, 2015, so nearly 4 years ago. 4 years on, what's your biggest takeaway in retrospect since making that statement and giving that TED Talk?
I think, and this is probably something that many in the audience would share. I think we all go through our own process of awakening, right? Of figuring out how we go through the world and realizing that although we have agency as individuals, there's also a structure in which we're born into, and that structure affects what is possible and maybe more difficult because of who we are, or the country we were born into, or the skin color, or the faith that you practice. And so I think when I did the talk and when I wrote Yassmin's story, and that they both was sort of around 2015, 2016, I had a very strong belief in the migrant story that my parents told me, which was, you work hard and you'll figure it out, and you work hard and eventually things will pay off, right? Like, that's all that matters. You just work hard, you ignore the haters. If people hate, that's just kind of the way the world is. You make your own kind of story. And I think, sadly, I've gotten to the point where I realize, like anyone who's got a sort of understanding of structural inequality, that it's not so simple, right? There are structures we're born into that mean that if you're a particular gender, or if you're a particular skin color, or if you're a particular race, or if you're a particular disability or sexuality, or whatever it might be, there are various marginalizations that mean it is just fundamentally the system is not set up for you, right? And so it's not just you're pushing things uphill. It's you have to figure out how to change the system, right? Or how to navigate through a system that's not set up for you, right? So there's like some ping pong maze, right? And you're cruising around and you're like, oh yeah, sweet. This is the route that's been mapped out for me because that's the route that all the other balls are taking, right? But all the other balls are like white male balls, and and you're actually just like a chocolate teddy bear and you can't roll, right? You're stuck. And so, and when you realize that that's the situation, you're like, okay, how am I supposed to? And that can be quite demoralizing, right? Because you're like, oh, I'm a chocolate teddy bear and I can't roll. What the fuck am I supposed to do, right? And I think that's kind of where I got in the last, maybe around 2 years ago, is I found myself in situations where what I actually said, what I actually did didn't matter. All that people saw was my identity, all my identifiers. And figuring out, I think, the next steps is actually a completely different sort of journey.
That leads on nicely, conveniently, to my next question, which is about otherness. And bearing in mind that you went to Australia after being born in Sudan before you were 2, and your family was one of 2 Sudanese families in Brisbane.
It was white.
Yeah. So how did you negotiate what I would imagine almost immediate racialization by the community?
Yeah, it's a really interesting...
When were you aware of your otherness?
Yeah. It's a really interesting question, I think. And I think I only began to understand that, the process that I went through when I moved here a couple of years ago, actually, because the experience of being, a Sudanese person, a Sudanese-born person, and a Muslim person in Britain is very different from that in Australia. Firstly, when you are not part of a big community that tells you how to be Sudanese, the only concept that you have of being Sudanese is that your parents teach you, right? And so the lessons that I learned from my parents was what I thought it meant to be Sudanese. So, for example, they never referred to my parents never referred to themselves as black, ever, right? So I had no concept that I was black, right? Like, it literally wasn't until I moved here. And I don't know if we had this conversation or I had it with someone, or I was like, blah, 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 I'm brown. And they were like, no, you're not. You're black. And I was like, but look, I don't. And it was just because my parents' understanding of blackness came from Sudan, which has a very different concept of that. And they, moved to Australia in their late 20s and 30s. And so their identity was already set. And so they didn't realize that my experience in a very white society was different, and therefore, the conversation. So I asked my uncle, who lives in Canada, whose kids call themselves black, if he called himself black, and he was like, whoops. He was like, no, I'm not black. I'm like, what are you? He's like, I'm an ordinary person. And I was like, that's super problematic, uncle, because you are black. And I think the challenge of growing up as other in a society that never teaches you what you are, with parents that don't have the language, I think it means that you have to go on this journey as yourself. I think also, I wore the hijab when I was like 10. And so my otherness was always about my faith, right? And so the concept of sort of intersectionality and understanding that my color also intertwined with the discrimination that came from my faith and gender and so on didn't really quite make sense to me at the time. I just understood that people didn't like Muslims. So there's been quite a lot of unlearning and unpacking that's happened over the last couple of years, which I think is very specific to the Australian context.
I could dwell there a lot longer, but I want to quickly move on to almost at the other side, because you were the first Muslim woman to wear the headscarf in your Christian high school. So that was like a first in its history. God knows how many centuries it was. And then first Muslim woman on oil rigs. And then identified, things like excelling in terms of, within the top 100 Australian engineers. So there's always this idea and notion of excelling or championing or being the first. So there's always this thing about forging a path from very, very young. And bearing in mind that we're given less room and space and permission to make mistakes, how did that impact? What was the drive for that? I mean, obviously, you're exceptional, you're good at what you do and everything else. But were you mindful of needing to keep your own identity within that? Because you then, outside of how people perceive you externally, but then it's like almost like your walking CV of achievement and breaking down barriers, and like, well, where's Yassmin amidst this?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and insightful question, right? Because I think, again, like my parents definitely, the story was, in order for us to change the opinion that people have of like Muslim people or people of color, we've got to be the best, right? That's the way that we're going to change things, is by being better. And I almost, like the way that my parents framed it was almost like it was a religious obligation, right? For us to be the best kind of representatives of our faith. And so you don't really think of what you yourself as an individual need, right? Because that's no longer important. You are part of a collective. You constantly represent a collective. But as you say, that means that you get to a point where you don't actually know who you are separate to all the things that you're supposed to represent. And yeah, I think, again, only like when I left my home, when I like left Australia and moved here, did I have this space to kind of be an individual and to kind of be like, oh, well, what does it mean to be who I am in a space where not everything that I do is going to be a reflection of every single Muslim person ever, right? Because if, like, the classic thing is like, I remember speaking to one of the engineers on the rig who was like, oh yeah, I hired a woman 20 years ago. She was terrible. Never hired a woman again. And it's like, I mean, we're not all the same person, firstly, but also that is like a classic thing of the first impression you have of one individual becomes a representation of every single person from that point. And so you're also super aware of that, right? You're also super aware that if you make a mistake, you are making it more difficult for those people that come after you. So it's not as if it's like a fake burden. It's not as if you're just making up this thing. It's actually a real burden. It is actually a real responsibility that you have in all these spaces. So part of me sometimes is like, oh, screw it. Like, I just want to do what I want to do. And then I'm like, oh, actually, if I just do whatever, it definitely will make it harder for the person after me. So what's more important, whatever I feel like I want to do, or trying to make things better so you're kind of in a catch-22.
Again, it leads in nicely to another question I want to ask you. When, is it 2017, in April, when you drew attention on a patriotic day, shall we say, in Australia to the situation facing refugees, including those who were being farmed out in Australia, and for whatever reason, you became persona non grata. You were vilified. You were like barely in your 20s, more or less. And you were faced with a situation where you were threatened, including at governmental level. And you came to London. And like you say, in terms of, I can imagine the experience there, and all of a sudden, it's not just like a so-called mistake. You gave your opinion, like many people do, but it was reclassified as almost like enemy of the state and treason, if treason that was possible. Where did that leave you in terms of belonging?
So the context is, really briefly, we have a day in Australia called Anzac Day, which is kind of like Remembrance Day. And on Anzac Day, on my Facebook page, I posted, "Lest we forget," and then in brackets, I posted Manus, Nauru, Palestine, Syria. Right? Manus and Nauru are these prison camps, essentially, where we hold asylum seekers to, like, in such terrible conditions that Amnesty has called it a man-made humanitarian crisis. Like, it is absolutely awful. And I didn't actually think it was that controversial. I was like, well, you know, it's a day where we don't forget people who have suffered from war. There are people who I think we shouldn't forget from other communities. Super, like, in fact, it was something that I, like, you know, sort of did on the side and then switched my phone off and went on my merry way. In the year after that, the papers wrote 200,000 words about me in the press, like completely there was like a concerted character assassination by the Murdoch press, the Conservative government, and public opinion. So from what I lost every single job that I ever had, like in all of my council positions. I had a broadcasting job on the national broadcaster. When I lost my job, the immigration minister said, "One down, many to go." People threatened, like one of the national radio presenters, I had written an article about how I get so many death threats. And one of the national presenters was like, "Fair enough, if I saw Yassmin on the street, I'd run her over." Like there was like literally people printed off posters with my face on it and like posted them around the city being like, you know, "This is an un-Australian, ungrateful," you know, like you can imagine the kinds of things. I moved house, changed phone number, and eventually left the country because why should anyone put up with that? Like really? Because it actually wasn't like, it's not, and this is the thing, right? It's not as if I actually hurt anyone. It's not as if what I did was a harmful, like an actively harmful mistake or actively harmful action, but I was the wrong person. And this was the thing. So a friend of mine at the time, about an hour after I posted it, was like, "Hey, Yassmin, you know that's kind of offensive." And I was like, nah. It was like, no, you should probably take it down. So I actually took it down about an hour later. And I said, you know, "I'm really sorry for any offense. That was like not my intention," right? Woke up the next day to find myself on the front page of every paper in the country, right? And what can you do apart from just apologize? The thing that I realized, and it didn't go on for 1 week. It didn't go on for 1 month. It went on for an entire year, right? And it wasn't, and when I announced that I was leaving the country, one of the national television stations ran a poll on whether or not I should leave the country, right? But they worded the poll so badly that you couldn't tell what the answer was. They were like, "Should Yassmin leave the country or should she stay? Yes or no?" Like they couldn't even do their incompetence properly. So like, but the thing that I wrote an essay about grief after this, right? Because for me, I had genuinely, truly believed that I had belonged, right? That's the heartbreak of it. I genuinely believed that I was Australian. I genuinely believed that I was equal. I genuinely believed that I had the same platform that everybody else had because I had worked hard. I was like Young Australian of the Year for my state. I was like a valedictorian mechanical engineer. I worked on oil rigs. I loved cars. I talked shit. Like how much more Australian could I be, right? I dropped the C-bomb all the time, right? Like that's the most Australian thing ever, right? So what more could I be? And that's the point, I think, where I realized that the naivety that I had so really, the optimism that I had so really and truly met the real world, which was to say that at some point you can't escape your identity. At some point, the world that you have grown up in is one that equality is conditional, right? And that was a heartbreaking thing. And I think that was the thing. It felt like betrayal. It felt like betrayal because none of the organizations stood up for me in the public space, right? None of the many places that I had worked for and volunteered for was like, you know what, Yassmin's actually all right. You know, maybe we shouldn't like send her death threats. Everyone was like, you should have known. I should have known what exactly? That I'm too black for that? And so that, I think, was the turning point in kind of my story. In the point at which I realized, well, actually, me trying to be the individual excellence, that'll help me out, but it's not necessarily going to help everyone else. It's actually not necessarily going to change the system. And if we're interested in leaving the world a better place for those who are coming after us, which is the best that we can do, then that's the thing that we need to work at dismantling.
On that point, before I ask you yet another question, I'm going to open up to the floor. But I'm curious because you are like a fashion maven on social media, you know. So
can we like write that down?
So yeah, how have you found that, and also how do you stop yourself from being pigeonholed? Because there's these are all different communities that you are sort of unifying in a way, you know. And how do you manage your social media, because you are skeptical about technology? I know there's multiple questions in there, but yeah.
I used to be super unfashionable and dorky growing up. Like I was a total, like I would wear cargo pants with my dad's sandals. Like, why? But I think what happened was when I started working on the rigs, interestingly, I could only wear coveralls, like the orange coveralls, and my steel cap boots for like weeks at a time. And so when I'd come off the rig, I'd be like, oh my God, I just want to wear something that's not orange, right? And then it became this thing. How I dressed became an opportunity for me to express who I was in different ways. And I'm also in a kind of a weird spot because I get to be a little bit African, a little bit Arab, a little bit street, you know, a little bit whatever. I get access to all these different things, and then being able to put all those things together in a way that perhaps is, especially for Australia, a little bit different. It's quite fun. And you get to tell different stories about who you are, I think, by the way you dress, right? Sometimes, like, every once in a while, I'll wear a abaya, which is kind of like the long black sort of outfit that you see like mostly Emirati and Saudi women wear. And I love wearing that because people like, they'll like defer to you quite cautiously on the street and you're like, I'm actually in my pajamas. It's great. Like, you don't know what's under here. I'm so comfortable. So yeah, it's been, I mean, but I guess your question around how the community has responded to that, I mean, I don't look traditionally Muslim, right? So I used to wear the hijab quite traditionally for the first 10 years of my life. I was like the classic nun look. And that meant very clearly that people would tell that I was Muslim and would treat me as such. Now people don't, and the biggest change, actually, speaking of the change when I moved to London, was that people didn't assume that I was Muslim anymore, which was a total trip. Right, because in Australia, people automatically assume, so I would get the racist hatred of like being a Muslim, which is like fine, I'm used to it, towel head, blah, 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 whatever. But I came here and I would be like halfway through a conversation with someone and be like, you know, Allahu Akbar or whatever. And, you know, as you do in conversation. And they'd be like, oh, are you Muslim? I'd be like, yeah, obviously, like, what did you think this was? They were like, oh, I just thought it was, you know, like a rap. And that was one of the most confusing things, because all of a sudden I went from being someone who was visibly Muslim to someone who was just like maybe fashionable. And it's still something that I'm getting used to, right? So I'm thinking of like getting a badge, which is like, hello, I'm Muslim. But I'm uncertain how that'll go.
I just want to ask you one final question. When you came to London 2 years ago, you're quoted as saying, you came to heal. Have you?
Alhamdulillah. Which means, for those who don't speak Arabic, like thanks to Lord, thanks to God. I I think I probably spent the first maybe 3 to 6 months in London kind of mostly at home, watching so much Netflix. And then I joined Second Home. And this is like not at all a sponsored post, but genuinely, I found like I got an Insta story advert, which I didn't even know existed, right, about this place with lots of plants down the road. I was like, oh yeah. And then I joined Second Home, and I had no friends. So I came to Second Home every single day for about 6 months straight and sat at the cafe and just talked shit at the cafe with the people at the cafe who are now my best mates. And, you know, and a couple of the people that would, you know, come through Second Home. And genuinely, just having a place that I could come to every day with people who knew me just as this kind of like weirdly dressed, you know, Australian chick, that helped me heal. And then somewhere along the way, I started to grow, right? And I think that's the really lovely thing about being in London for me. That's the lovely thing about being able to share my story with you all, is that it's not like if this was a conversation we had a year ago, it would be a story of heartbreak and betrayal and how the world is awful. But actually, it's a story about how this city gave me a new lease on life, how community can make you a better version of who you are, how spaces like Second Home sometimes have a bigger impact in our lives than we think, right? And how sometimes you never know. Because if you'd asked me when I wrote that book if I would be living some hipster life, drinking oat milk lattes, right, in London, baby, it's me to be like, But here I am, right? And I feel really, really lucky to be here. So thank you.
We feel blessed to have you. All right. So as far as I'm concerned, as someone who's born in London, I could not think of you anything other apart from the accent as a Londoner. All right. So
I'm working on it.
Keep it. But look, thanks, Yassmin.